Greetings, everyone. My name is Peter Young. I'm a member of the Committee of 100, and I chair the Committee 100 Asian American Career Ceilings Initiative. And I am very, very pleased to have tonight's guest, Andrew Yang, as our guest for this fireside chat on the topic of running for office, Asian American obstacles and opportunities. Before we get started, just a few minutes about the background. This is the 22nd webcast that we've done, and it started in early 2020, and we've tried to explore a whole variety of angles around this question, whether it's the research that's being done or what different nonprofits are doing to try to solve the problem, to the perspectives from different industries, from millennials, et cetera. And the recordings of these are available to everyone on the Committee 100 website. I also want to mention that we have the next one is going to be on December 12th, and that will feature two co-authors of a McKinsey report on Asian American workers, diverse outcomes and hidden challenges. And they did a lot of research and published a report on such issues as the model minority image problem, the perpetual foreigner perception, and a whole variety of issues that I think you're going to find very interesting. And that's going to be on December 12th at 11 o'clock Eastern time. So those of you who are interested, we hope you'll join. So why did this series start? Mainly because if you think about all of the challenges for Asian Americans, well, a serious one, and one that, affirmative action and all these other issues really don't address, are the barriers to achievement in a wide variety of professions in the United States. It's a serious problem. If you look across many, many industries, whether it's corporate or it's nonprofits, or in this case, government service, you'll find there really is not a good representation, a fair representation of Asian Americans at senior ranks in those different disciplines. So we will want to try to figure out what the problem is, but also do something about it. The last thing I want to mention is there is a social media site that was established a couple of months ago that has a collection of events calendars, a directory of all the organizations that are focused on this issue, and various discussion groups around topics such as government, legislation, corporate structures, et cetera. So I encourage you to join that and engage in the dialogue. And I'll send all of you who registered for this event, I'll send you the link so that you can join if you wish. So we're very, very pleased. So Andrew Yang is a household name. I think everyone that I can think of knows him. So trying to do a long introduction is not necessary, but he's really someone who has accomplished quite a lot and didn't start out in politics. In fact, we'll talk about his upbringing and his careers before he went into politics, but he got inspired and found ways to essentially overcome obstacles and run for office. And so we're going to explore some of those. So Andrew, thank you very much for agreeing to be part of this event. We're all rooting for you. I'd like to start out though first, in every case, about sort of the upbringing and the background of the people before they went into whatever profession we are talking about. Maybe if you could share with us a brief description of your upbringing and the two careers that you pursued before you went into politics, legal and entrepreneurism. Maybe you could talk a little bit about that.
Sure, Peter. It's great to be here. I'm really curious about the nature of the people who are attending. How many are actually thinking about running for office themselves, or whether you just see this as a problem for the community and you'd like to help. I will confess that when I wrote a list of my life's goals in my 20s, which I highly recommend, One of them was to elevate a national political figure. It was not to be one myself. And I have a feeling that there are at least some people here who resemble that, where you're like, hey, I'd really like to help Asians run for office successfully, but you're not planning on doing it yourself. That's just a guess. I wish I could get some feedback from the people in attendance. For
Well,
me,
actually, Andrew, I can help you there because everyone who registered for this, and 574 people registered for this, everyone who registered had to just answer a couple of questions, one of which is, what are they interested? Are they interested in government, so forth? And we'll take a look through that, and I'll share with you some of that feedback that's relevant to your question.
yeah, I'd be super curious because it's a real problem. So my upbringing was similar, I'd imagine, to a lot of people in attendance, where my parents immigrated to the US as students from Taiwan. I was born in the 70s and was told to get good grades, go to good schools, try and get a good job. I was not told about American politics as something that I should be interested in as a path or a livelihood, for sure. My parents discouraged me when I did start talking about it years and years later. And when I was in my 20s, I did think to myself, oh, I'd like to help someone else. Because in my mind, if you had a rational person in, it didn't need to be you. So for me, I went to college and law school and practiced law very briefly, and then started an illfated.com in the first bubble, which was a fantastic growth experience. Then worked for a series of other startups, became the CEO of an education company that grew to become number one in the US and was bought by a public company in 2009 when I was 34. So between the ages of 24 and 34, graduating from law school, I was a startup guy, first failed startup guy, and then a less failed startup guy, I suppose. The big juncture in my career was when I was 36. I decided to leave the company that acquired my little company to start a nonprofit. And that nonprofit was called Venture for America. We tried to create jobs in Detroit, Cleveland, Baltimore, New Orleans, St. Louis, Birmingham, a bunch of places I'd never been before. And that was the single biggest choice that ended up moving me in a political direction, even though at that point I was still very apolitical. I was the founder and CEO of a very wholesome entrepreneurship org. But when you are doing wholesome work, it turns out that you meet a lot of the political figures. So I was honored by the Obama administration twice, got to bring my wife to meet him, met senators, governors, the whole nine. And then in 2016, when Trump won, I got a sinking feeling and thought, well, things are going very poorly in the US. And I thought that I could help explain what was happening and maybe advance solutions. So that's around when the people here would have heard of me, circa 2018 or 2019, I'd imagine. Because you all are Asian American or Chinese American, you probably heard about me in 2018 because there was like the underground Asian guy running for president stuff in 2018. But in my case, I decided to run in 2017 and then prepared to run and announced early 2018. But it was the culmination of a whole series of experiences and decisions I'd made for years prior.
But tell me a little about the links. First of all, some of the changes there are not that common. It's not. You went to law school working for a very prestigious law firm whose name I know, and then to go from that and go into a startup. I mean, that's, usually people who become lawyers are not necessarily, have the personalities of startup guys. So how did that happen?
I was 25 and the lawyers around me seemed quite unhappy. And I thought, well, I don't want to do this long term. So if that's the case, I should leave as quickly as possible. And I also felt myself getting better at the job. And my wisdom was that if I get too good at this job, I'll probably end up doing this job for a long time. So I should leave before I get good. And I think I was right. So, when you rewind, it's true, Peter. I think leaving Davis Polk was possibly the biggest fork in the road for me, aside from starting Venture for America. Those were two very big decisions that were somewhat unconventional. But the thing I would suggest to people who are here is to reframe what you think the risks are. So my risks in leaving Davis Polk, like I owed law school loans. Yes, I might not um, be able to get as cush a legal job again, I suppose. But I thought the real risk was that I would never start a business. I would never do anything that was really meaningful. And at the time, I didn't have any family obligations. You know, I
Oh,
was
so
a single.
you could take some risks, right?
Yeah, and I don't know how old the people who are in attendance are, but the risks, most of the risks are in your head, truly,
Mhm.
because you're probably pretty smart, educated, and employable. And if things go wrong, you can probably get a decent job somewhere. Was my thinking. I was like, look, I'm
Mhm.
25, start this business. If it fails, I'll just get another job. I'll be 28 or 29 or 30. So in my case, the startup journey ended up taking me, I suppose, 5 or 6 years before I found a good opportunity after my company failed, because those were kind of tough times. I left the firm in 2000, and then the bubble burst in 2001 and 2002. And then there weren't many good jobs around between 2002 and 2003 or so. So it was a bit of a rocky road. But I'll also say, just speaking personally, a lot of it for me was based upon uh, whether I thought I could get a date or a girlfriend. Um,
Ah,
and,
there we
and
go. There we go.
and the kind of women that will date you just because you have like a high-end corporate job, like I found those women um kind of like sort of tough to click with
Mhm.
anyway. So it was like, well, if I go do this startup stuff, like I'll become more interesting, I'll have an interesting career, like I'll meet interesting people. And I ended up meeting my now wife, and it turns out that her father is an entrepreneur. She's kind of unconventional herself. And so, like I guess the big lesson I would impart to people is that the risks are not as grievous as you might imagine. If you decide to run for office and you lose, like, you'll survive. You know what I mean? It's like, as long as you have good relationships and foundation and values, which I'd imagine most of you have.
Yeah. Well, and actually, I at one point I used to love to study successful people and look back at their backgrounds. And the one thing I noticed was consistently is that every single one had uh, a major pivot that they had to make in life. And they also didn't have perfect records. They had setbacks and so forth. But it wasn't so it's not that if you're to be successful, you can't have any setbacks. You will have them. It's, do you pivot from them and do you learn from them? And it sounds like in your case, that was part of the story, right?
Well, certainly in politics, if you think you're just going to climb the ladder, it probably will not work. That would be a lesson I would impart. I know a lot of people in politics who think they're climbing the ladder, and it turns out they're not.
Mhm. Yeah.
That it's probably an Asian thing too. To be honest with you. So I agree that there probably will be a bit of a risk or a leap or a pivot at some point, and the principles from my experience are that if you bite off more than you can chew, you end up growing various capacities. Even when I was running for president, when I got started, I was an accomplished, nonprofit executive and leader, but it turns out that's different than being a presidential candidate. And it took me months to adapt and figure that out. Just like if someone here randomly raised your hand and said, I'm going to run for city council, I'm going to run for a school board, I'm going to run for state rep or something like that, there would be all these things that you don't know how to do yet, but then you have to trust that you'll learn them and that you have the capacities and will to be as good or better at them than the next person.
Yeah, no, that's right. Well, one advantage you did have was when you ran for president, no one could attack your previous voting record, right? In Congress or the Senate. And you could have a fresh start and fresh set of views and convey them to your, constituency.
Yeah, and I was driven by a mission and a vision that was independent of whether or not I was going to win or lose.
Right.
It's like I didn't think I was going to be president. You know what I mean? Like I had a mission though.
Yeah. Well, stepping back and looking at the big picture. So, as you know, Asian Americans are severely underrepresented in many levels of government. And we got to remember that there are different levels. There's the local, state, federal, et cetera. uh, and relative to, our representation in the population. What do you see if you were to look at the big picture and said, what would you list as the obstacles for Asian Americans advancing in politics that has contributed to this, misrepresentation? And are some of them systemic, but are some of them self-created, right?
Well, I'm happy to throw some numbers at it because it's the way I
Mhm.
think. So Asian Americans are approximately 6.5% of the US population. We are approximately 0.9 of 1% of elected officials. So we are the most underrepresented community in the country. And then you figure out, okay, why is that? And I think that it starts at every level. I think fewer of us think that running for office is a good idea. I think fewer of us then do it. I think that when we do it, our community does not really bend over backwards to try and help us. I think that most of us are running in communities that will not be predominantly Asian American. So you'll wind up with a community to appeal to that might need a bit of familiarization with you and what makes you tick. I think that there's a pretty rigid hierarchy in both the Democratic and the Republican Party that will try and box out Asian Americans who decide that they want to run for office. They'll be told, like, wait your turn, wait your turn. And then when you actually get into the mix politically, it becomes a money and media battle. And we don't have media support in the way that other communities do. And our communities may or may not donate to us at the same levels. Statistically, we donate at lower levels than other populations.
Yeah,
We also
yeah.
vote at lower levels than other populations. So if you say, why is it? I think it's at every level, both internal and structural.
Yeah, yeah. It's not, you can't just blame the system alone. A lot of it's the culture and the behavior of Asian Americans generally as well. But it's both. If you look, one of the things.
I'm actually going to say too that this
Yeah.
two-party system right now, it's rewarding people who are more sensationalistic and ideological, and Asian Americans tend not to be that. We tend to be a bit more pragmatic and practical and even-handed and reasonable. And so in an era of social media where you get rewarded for being inflammatory and maybe crazy, that's not necessarily set up for us.
Yeah. Well, one of the observations, though, is if you look at different ethnic groups, right? If you compare Asian Americans to the Latinos and the African Americans and so forth, or the Jewish community, for example, it just seems, if you look at it, and I haven't looked at it scientifically, that they are better organized as a group, right, than Asian Americans. And why is that? And what do you think Asian Americans should do to learn from these other groups who have been pretty successful in many of those groups of getting people elected and appointed and so forth?
Yeah, that's one reason I'm here tonight, Peter, is that our community is not terribly unified around candidates or issues. And you could say that we're fragmented in the sense that there's the Chinese American community, the Korean American community, the Vietnamese American community. You could just go on and on. I mean, that 6.5% is segmented into various groups. And we don't have the media. We don't have the cultural unity. We don't have the consolidation. There are real differences between us and these other communities. And there are people that are trying to change that. I'm sure C100 is working on efforts. The Asian American Foundation, I think, is trying to emulate the Jewish experience and population in various ways. We have a long way to go. I think the anti-Asian violence is highlighting for a lot of people just how on the outside looking in we are in many respects. And it's going to take a lot to change that. I mean, one of the things about America that most of you may realize is that you're going to have to fight for it. You know what I mean? Like, if you just wait around for it to change, never change.
Yeah, no, that's right. Well, I do think some of it is cultural, but also the reality is Asian American, it's not just one big group. I mean, there are big difference between South Asians and East Asians, et cetera, that are,
I want to suggest too, Peter, the two-party system is setting us up
right.
to fail. against each other. Because if you think about it, like you have these two sides, Dems and Republicans, and then a lot of the media is very Dem. And then let's say you have an Asian population or an Asian narrative. It does not get airtime in the Dem media narrative.
Right.
I'll just, I mean, they're like anti-Asian violence, like they're like it gets treated in a particular way, but not treated in a way that a lot of Asian Americans actually find resonant or practical. And so the two-party system and the polarized media actually suppresses the Asian American voice, in my opinion.
Yeah, that's right. No, I think that's right. And I think there's some groups are, naturally tend to focus on their natural thing is pulling together as a group. Whereas, Asian Americans in general are more, family group oriented, so forth, as opposed to group oriented, right? So, and, that may change. It may change through generations, so forth, but that's certainly one of the factors. There must have been some moment, if you look back and say, there must have been some moment when you said, I'm going to run for office and I'm going to run for president of the United States, right? There was some point, and I'm sure you remember that point in time. Tell us what went through your mind at the time. How did you come to the decision to run? It must have been kind of an interesting moment in time for you.
Yeah, it was March 2017. I sat down with a guy named Andy Stern, who used to run the biggest labor union in the country, the SEIU. And he'd written a book called Raising the Floor in 2015 about the fact we're going to automate the jobs away and we need something like an income floor. And he ended his book in 2015 saying someone should run for president on this. So I had lunch with him in New York City 2 years later and said to him, is anyone running for president on this? And he said no. And then I said, then I will. And I told myself that if no one else was doing it, I would do it. So that was when I knew I was going to do it. I then asked Andy, because I figured he had some political experience, like, what is the first thing a presidential candidate should do? And he said, you should make a list of people that will donate $2,800, which is the max to your campaign, and just make a list of 100, 200 people, and then have that as your seed round. And I said, sure, I can do that. And then I went home and made that list of 100 to 200 people, and then returned to Andy with the list, in part to show Andy I was serious, because I figured having such a prominent labor leader behind me would be helpful. And also, it turns out I did turn around and ask those 100 to 200 people for $2,800. So, and some said yes, some ignored it, which is what will happen if anyone here runs for office. They'll surprise you too. It's like people that you would expect just to give you the money like this because the money's nothing to them and you're friends with them won't. Weird. Like, by the way, like, do I still remember that? Oh yeah, I remember that. No, you as a political figure, you're not allowed to act like a dick about it. But you still remember. And then you also remember the people who you don't know that well that came through for you in a big way, who didn't just send you the money, but were like, hey, like let me have an event for you. Let me try and get behind you. So it goes in both directions. But that's when I knew I was going to do it.
What's really extraordinary in listening to you and then thinking about what you're saying is, the vast majority of people, at least I know, who run for politics, they do it because, they want to have influence, they want to have some clout, they want to have recognition. You clearly did it around a concept that you felt needed to be, put forth, right? Which is minimum income and so forth. And that's, do you feel that's somewhat unusual, among the people who are in politics?
Well, I think this is one thing that might be specific to the Asian American community that I'd like to explore a bit more, because you're right. Like I did not care whether I had a future in elected office. I will confide this all to you. I know tons of elected officials, and most of them seem to have terrible jobs. I mean, like there are very few of them like, ooh, I really want that job. Like most of their jobs seem pretty unhappy to me, so it's not like I really wanted one of those jobs.
Right.
It's like, I just want to try and keep this country intact so that our kids can grow up in a place we're excited about. Now, is that what motivates different political figures? Most of them, no. Most of them just seem to have a sense that they they themselves should be in the, in the driver's seat or in that seat or in the spotlight. And they when I saw all the ads with my own face, it was deeply uncomfortable for me. When I saw the national debate stage and me standing next to Joe Biden, I was like, wow, who's the Asian guy? Even though it was me. So there were a bunch of experiences like that where like I wasn't trying to do it because I just thought like Andrew Yang should be, a thing. And I'm going to suggest that there are different people who are watching this where, you should explore why you want to run. Because I think Asian Americans are somewhat uncomfortable with self-promotion in that way. And you could see that as a weakness in the political realm. But I think that it can be a strength if you're about something that's not just you. It's like if you're running for school board because you really want to see something happen in that school district, it can drive you in a
Right.
different way, particularly if the process is unpleasant or difficult, where it's not about you. It's like, well, I just really want to see this thing happen. It can be at any level. But I think that sort of approach might be more natural for us, might be more compelling to other people. I think there's one of the questions that you're meant to ask later is that,
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
is that a lot of the Asian American candidates that you've interviewed for this series, myself included, weren't running on what you call Asian issues.
Right.
And I think that's appropriate. One, because we're 6% of the population and not enough to win most races. So, if you want to run on that stuff, like unless you live in a community where, like that makes sense.
It might work if you're in Hawaii.
Yeah.
Right?
Or in like a particular,
Yeah, exactly.
Uh,
Or a very heavy Asian neighborhood, right?
But there's like a bigger concern, in my opinion, which is that this country's cracking up. The political system's disintegrating.
Right.
And so if you're like, ooh, I want to take my place in the disintegrating system, it's like, well, good for you. But I think that the real task at hand for us should be, I don't want this system to crack up. Like I want America's democracy to function and make sense. And our families came here not to help America, like get through a really rough time. I mean, they came here so we'd have better opportunities. But now the shoe is on the other foot. Like if you're going to consider doing this, I genuinely think you might want to do it because this country needs us. This country needs rational, pragmatic, non-ideological, selfless leadership right now. It is not getting that at most levels. It is not getting that even in its media.
Yeah.
And the incentives are tearing this country apart. And we might be able to be the group that can fix it or solve it.
Yeah. Well, it's shocking to say, of course, that the motivations of a lot of people who are in office today and so forth and running, it's the underlying driver is not what you said. It's not because fundamentally, they care about the country and they want to do it to make things work well. A lot of it has to do with power and influence and so forth. Well, I was going to talk later about what characteristics you felt, sort of like a checklist of, do I match the right profile of someone who should be in office? So I'll move it up in the list of questions and say, because you started talking about that, if you think about, now, the unfortunate thing is there are many different offices and the traits of someone who would be appointed to some governmental agency versus running might be different. But if you thought about, elective office versus appointed or governmental, cabinet position, et cetera, what would be the things that you would say, these things have to be true about you for you to want, and these are the things that if they're true, you shouldn't try? Do you sort of have a list that you could share with the audience?
Well, I think it's much more rational and reasonable for most people to try and get appointed, because that doesn't involve going through an election. You primarily have to be really useful and successful in fundraising typically, and make friends with various folks who wind up winning office. What comes to mind to me is someone like Chris Liu, who was, I want to say, like Obama's law school classmate, who ended up being in the inner circle and so ended up with various appointments. I don't think Chris ever had to stand for an election. So that's one rational way to go. Pile in behind various people and help behind the scenes, and then if you're competent and effective, then you can wind up in a political appointment. And then there's elected office, which requires some fortitude and thick skin, and probably the patience to run multiple times, the grit and willingness to stick yourself out there and ask your friends to do stuff for you and ask for money of strangers and friends. So there are different profiles. I'm going to say, for better or for worse, I think Asian Americans are more comfortable in the first one than the second one. But we need more folks to do the second one. If you're not going to do the second one, that which most of us won't, frankly, then you should just really try to lean in to help someone who's already doing it. And I think you had Alan Fung here, who I like a lot. He's a reasonable Republican. There's a guy named Jay Chen who I like a lot, who I'm doing an event for. So if there are people who are running and you're not going to run, like, at least try to check out the people who are running and help them.
Well, that's right. Yeah, because you're absolutely right, because helping the political process isn't just running for office yourself, right? You can help other people and have as big an impact. By the way, when you talked before about previous speakers and what they were talking about, you summarized about, obviously our chairman of the Committee 100, Gary Locke, was in government, both appointed and elective, and he was elected as governor of Washington. Alan Fung was a speaker on a panel, and he was for 12 years the mayor of Cranston, Rhode Island, and now he's running for Congress and doing well. But the one comment they made is really essentially what you said, which is you can't run and say, I'm running because I'm trying to help Asian Americans, right? Because if there's such a small part, you can run and succeed, and Gary Locke said, is if you find issues that you care about that resonate to the population that they're your voters, right? And it may be that it overlaps with the issues that Asian Americans care about, but you have to have broad appeal to a voter, or you'll never win, right? And both of them succeeded because people identified with them and their values across, many different ethnic groups and ages and genders and so forth. And I think that was true for you, right? You didn't run and say, vote for me because I'm Asian American. You said, vote for me because here are the things I care about that I want to try to implement. Is that a fair statement?
Yeah, completely. And I think it's a very positive role for Asian Americans too, to reach out to people who are both inside and outside of our communities and try and solve problems that are that affect everybody. Which right now, again, that sort of official is in short supply in our country. It's a good fit, the opportunity and and our strengths.
Before I move to the next question, I notice a number of people have typed in questions, which is great, because what we are going to do is we'll reserve some time at the end to try to answer some of the questions that you've typed in the Q&A part of the Zoom mechanism here. One question now, and as you reflect back on your political career, are there some lessons that you learned? Is there anything that you would have done differently if you could turn the clock back or were to run again?
It's a great question. I actually did a fair amount of unpacking and reflection, and then put it in this book that just came out on paperback a week or two ago. It's called Forward. And one of the things I do is break down the structural issues. So it turns out that different parties have a different relationship with the media. And I was running as a Democrat. And so I did not realize the central role the media played until I was in the midst of the race. 69% of Democrats have a very high trust or confidence in the national media. If you talk to Republicans, that goes down to 15%. So your relationship with the media actually is very, very much along party lines. Independent, it's somewhere between, it's like 38, 39%. So when I was running for president, I did not realize that there was going to be such this strange media gauntlet / suppression going on. I thought the media would play it straighter than it did.
Mhm.
But a producer named Ariana Picari came out from MSNBC. She quit, I think, in 2019, and she said she was given a list of candidates never to have on air, and I was on that list. So if
Really?
so if you are thinking that the media has its thumb on the scales, it totally does. And if you are going to have an Asian American candidate running at certain levels, I think that's something that we need to try and address for ourselves, where I think that there should be a massive investment in an Asian American media organization or voice, because right now it's absent at a national level.
Yeah, I think that's right. So a number of lessons along the way, right? And as they said, the key in life is to learn from your lessons along the way, right?
Yeah, and I did, I tried to make the stories relatable and fun. So if you're considering running for office, I would urge you pick up this book, because I talk about the experience of a candidate, some of which would apply to anybody, some of which wouldn't.
Yeah. So Andrew, I know this is not on the list of questions, but I have a question for you related to this. So you have a lovely wife who I've met, and I've met your two young sons who are really, quite wonderful. Would you ever want either one of your sons to run for office? Would you
Um,
encourage them?
I would encourage them if it seemed like the right fit for them. That they're young, they're 10 and 7, but neither of them seems like they have any future in politics, to be honest with you. So I'd be shocked.
Mhm.
But if if one of them came back years later and said, hey, I want to do this thing, I'd be supportive. I mean, I think that's true whether they start a business, whether they're doing different things, especially because at this point I've been so entrepreneurial where you can't discourage your children from doing what you did.
Yeah. Well, obviously what you said was, it wasn't like your parents, when you were growing up, said, Andrew, we really think you ought to run for office, right? Because they clearly, you said
No,
they
yeah,
didn't do that.
that was not in the family
When you
values.
told them, hey, I think I'm going to run for office, what was their reaction, and did it change over time?
Yeah, both my parents and my in-laws were very, very negative. My parents were concerned about my safety, my marriage, my family relationships, and it turned around during the campaign when one of the high points was in Taiwan. My father attended a watch party of one of the debates that I was in, because I was something of a folk hero in Taiwan during this time. And then he told the people in attendance that that's my son, and then everyone cheered and like bought him a drink. And I heard about this while I was on the trail in Iowa, and I was like, oh wow, like that's incredible, because I remember my dad trying to talk me out of it years prior, and then there he is, proud papa a couple of years later.
Yeah, well, that's great. Well, in my own upbringing, I was in classic Chinese American family with, my father was born in 1920. So you can imagine he had the traditional view of what was a good career. And they basically said, study hard and either get a PhD or be a scientist, and don't be in sports, and don't run for student government, right? And, of course, we know that's not necessarily the right formula for success. And so, I rebelled and ran for student government office successfully
You've
without
got
their
a good
knowing.
politician name too, Peter
Oh, yeah,
Young.
absolutely,
I could
absolutely.
travel.
Yeah, absolutely. And I was in 3 varsity sports, and they finally gave up, but but they I think they reluctantly later said, something, maybe we weren't maybe we were wrong, right? Maybe there are other ways that one could be successful in society. But it took a while to educate them that in fact, there's a different approach.
Yeah, it's taken me X years multiple times.
Yeah, yeah. So back to the picture, back to our audience. The profile of the audience is pretty broad. We have everything from Committee 100 members who've signed up for this event, who, by the way, the average age is not 20, by the way, and people of all different ages and different backgrounds. What advice would you give them in terms of, before you talked about, is there a fit between you and the idea of being in office, right, appointed or whether, but, what advice would you give people if they embark on the process of trying to get there?
So everyone here has a role to play, and if you run for office, then you should reach out to all the people here and say, "Look, I'm doing this thing," and then ask for help. Try and get the support. One of my frustrations with this community is that there's one thing we have, it's money, and yet we do not pile in even financially behind candidates who could really use those funds. And for most of us, the amount of money that we could donate politically, it's trivial. You know, like a lot of the people here can afford 2,900, which is the federal max. And if you do that, by the way, that puts you in the top 1% of Americans immediately. And then if you donate 2,900 to any candidate, like they'll they'll listen to you. If you start uh, hosting events for people, they'll listen to you. I mean, we should use what we have at a minimum. And for folks who are interested in running, you will change, you will evolve, you will grow. Maybe stuff that right now is uncomfortable for you, you know, like will become, I won't say enjoyable because that's a lie, but less uncomfortable over time. And it's what we need. You know what I mean? Like you can do it and say, look, like someone has to do this thing, and I'm going to do it, and then just apply the same skills and grit and perseverance to this process as you do anything else. I mean,
Yeah.
a lot of the people on this call are very successful at various things, and then politics has not been your pursuit. But if you put in the same level of effort, dedication, and time and resources into politics, you would succeed.
Yeah.
Because you know, like that will adapt, we'll figure things out, we'll grow.
Yeah. By the way, one thing you haven't mentioned, but I will mention is it helps to have ferocious support from those around you and your family. And you don't know, but the first member of your family I met was actually your wife, because a group of us were invited to have dinner at Yusai Khan, who's a Committee 100 member, at her home. There was a group of about 20 or so people. You couldn't make it because you had a conflict, but your wife went to dinner, and I happened to be seated next to her. And I got to tell you, you have a ferocious supporter, right? in your wife, which obviously had to be an important factor for your success.
Yeah, I'm super fortunate and grateful, and I do think that's integral, vital for someone who decides to head down this road. I mean, I have seen relationships be torn apart by one of the spouses entering into politics, and I've seen relationships that grow stronger.
Mhm.
And I'm super lucky to be able to honestly say that my wife and I are in the latter category, in part because when she came out on the trail, she ended up discovering all these people that cared deeply about her. And that was stunning to her, because for the first 2 years of my presidential campaign, we had a little bit of a divide and conquer mentality. It was, you know, you go out and run for president, and I will make sure that the kids are strong and whole. But then when she and the kids joined me on the trail in Iowa, it was so much better, so much more enjoyable. And now as a family, we look back very fondly on that time and those experiences, including getting on dad's campaign bus. You know, the kids still remember that. So it's, you do need to integrate your family into it to the extent possible, though. And that does mean having a spouse that's actually invested.
Now we have 14 questions, of which a couple I won't read because they're not, they're not germane to the topic. But before I do that, I do want to talk about one thing that you really, really care about right now, which is the forward party, the third party, which, by the way, I do think, you and I may not agree on everything, but one thing's for sure is in this two-party system, the power, there's a power in having an independent party can have a lot of power on the increment, right? Because, if it's a 50-50 in the Senate, whatever, if you have one or two senators, for example, that are part of your party, you wield a lot more power than just, then you have a lot more power than just one or two seats, right? Do you want to talk a little bit about what you're doing and what the objective is?
Now, Peter, thank you. So I'm going to speak about the Asian American experience in partisan politics for a minute as a backdrop for this. So if you rewind about 12 years, Chinese Americans and Asian Americans were about 50-50 Republican Democratic. And there were a lot of Republicans who were small business owners, wanted lower taxes. If you fast forward to today, we're now 65-35 Democrat versus Republican, because more Chinese Americans and Asian Americans have become uncomfortable with this version of the Republican Party that's become kind of xenophobic and unwelcoming. So the problem is that as you shift to the Democratic Party does not prioritize us or our community. It doesn't. There's like a totem pole and a hierarchy, and we're relatively low, and you could, find, like a host of very concrete data points for our not being prioritized. But in a two-party system, there's no real competition. There's no genuine competition, because what the Democrats will say is like, well, what are you going to do? You're stuck with us. And so the argument to Chinese Americans and Asian Americans is, look, this two-party system, it's getting increasingly extreme and ideological, and we are somewhere in the middle. Naturally, we're kind of more moderate and pragmatic and solutions driven. But that voice is disempowered in this structure. Right. So what we should do is fashion our own new centrist lane. As you said, you do not need to win 51% of races. You just need 1 or 2 senators, and you can control the whole thing. And there's a senator who resembles this right now, who's running for office in Utah, named Evan McMullin. He's running as an independent. So we might have this fulcrum in the U.S. Senate as quickly as January of next year. So this is not some far out, we can do this quick. Right. And my pitch to Asian Americans and Chinese Americans is, look, your downside scenario here is that the Democratic Party or either party feels like they have to compete for us, because right now they do not. They're like, whatever, you're stuck. Like, we don't have to care about you. If we had our own lane, then at a minimum, the parties need to deliver for us. At a maximum, we end up in this pole position, and we can have a genuine seat at the table. In this two-party system, if we just like run around for scraps, it'll never happen for us. And by the way, this country is going to tear itself apart, and we're going to wind up in a confrontation with China. And you know who's going to get thrown under the bus? Because there's one thing that the two parties can agree on right now is who can be tougher on China. So in this scenario, Chinese Americans and Asian Americans will get thrown under the bus, and no one's going to care about us. That is where we're heading right now. And so the Forward Party, what I am building right now, is meant to be this fulcrum, which, by the way, at this point, 50% of Americans want this thing. It's just not being permitted because of various obstacles that have been set up to prevent competition for the two dominant parties that more and more people are dissatisfied with. So if you have an interest in helping me build this thing, which in my opinion is vital to the future of Chinese Americans and Asian Americans in this country politically, you can go to forwardparty.com or andrewyang.com. I have a blog, I have an email. We're building this thing. We already, the Forward Party, within 1 year, already the 3rd biggest political party in the country by resources. So let's build this thing. Let's save the country. Let's give ourselves a genuine seat at the table. It will not happen if we play a game that is systematically stacked against us.
By the way, I love to read the history of American politics, and if you read the history of American politics and what parties existed at different points in time, there is a long history of multiple parties. And a fact that people don't realize is the Republican Party was a third party. They weren't really in existence. They became a third party under Abraham Lincoln. So
Abraham Lincoln won with 39% of the vote. He was a third party candidate, to your point, Peter.
Yes.
And if you wind up with a Biden-Trump rematch, which is the most likely scenario, 58% of Americans don't want either of those guys. So if you had some alternative, it would get a lot of energy very quickly.
Yeah. Well, like in any strategy, the key is not necessarily having more troops or more power. It's being smart about how you do things. And
in a polarized country, you don't need 51%. You just need, like, let's say 5 to 10% in the middle. Okay. So, and then we can swing a lot of things.
So we have 17 questions, and I'm going to just, there's some that obviously, shouldn't be, shouldn't be raised, but uh, here's one that's directly related to what you just said. So Mr. Anonymous Attendee says, absent ranked choice voting or a parliamentary system, why won't a third party do more harm than good? A reasonable question, right?
Well, it depends upon what you interpret as harm, because there's a presupposition on both sides that any votes you take are from them.
Mhm.
I'm going to suggest that both sides can't be right. Like you are going to wind up first. I love the fact that this person already knows that if you have ranked choice voting or a parliamentary system, then you're in good shape. And I'm going to suggest that right now, ranked choice voting is on the ballot in a place like Nevada, and then both parties are fighting against it. So this is the reform you need. But if you wait for the parties to say, look, we should have an open system where people can run and have have more dynamism, they'll never do it. So you kind of need to force them to do it. And one way to force them is to run someone. Now, if you let's say I'm going to assume that this questioner is a Democrat, where there's a presupposition among Democrats that any votes you take are from them. And there are plenty of facts that would suggest the opposite. The most avid supporters of a third party are moderate Republicans who do not like Trump. And those, by the way, are the early adopters of the Forward Party. Governor Christie, Todd Whitman, David Jolly, Miles Taylor, all moderate Republicans who've said, you know what, this Republican Party has lost its mind. So people who think that you're just taking from Democrats, like, maybe not. The single most prominent third-party candidate of recent vintage was Ross Perot, who got 19% of the vote in '92, and that resulted in Bill Clinton winning. So I'm supposing that this anonymous person is a Democrat who thinks that third parties just hurt Democrats, and there's plenty of evidence to the contrary. If it's the other direction, then I misinterpreted the question. But
Yeah.
the other thing I want to say
Yeah.
too is that there are 506,000 races around the country that are not the presidential. 70% of them are uncompetitive or uncontested, and that's a disaster. Let's say you live in California. Republicans can't win anything significant in most places, and so the Democrats are running various things into the ground. People are pissed off. Asians are pissed off. Asians are voting out school board members and prosecutors and the rest of it, trying to fix things. But the Democrats are like, well, you're stuck with us because there's no dynamism in the system. You can't compete as a Republican. So if you have an independent party, you get the Republicans and the pissed off Democrats and the independents, you can actually create a real choice. At a minimum, you hold the Democrats' feet to the fire to deliver. At a maximum, you change some things.
Yeah. By the way, Andrew.
So the questioner is just like fast forwarding right to the presidential. There are 506,000 races you could do good in that are not the presidential, including the Senate race I described, where it's just an independent versus a Republican because the Democrats aren't running someone. So there are all sorts of opportunities.
Yeah, and actually, we're looking at a bigger picture. My own personal view about is that there are some serious flaws with the American political system today at different levels. And maybe one way of looking at it was the founders of this country did a great job designing a federal government system for 13 states and a very small number of people. And where you could wait 3 weeks to declare war because it took a long time. That's how long it took for ships to get from Europe to here. But they haven't really changed the system in a way that is more efficient. The internet has changed the whole world. I mean, a good example is this. When our country was founded, the most common business structure was a partnership or a single owner, right? Proprietorship. If you never invented the corporate structure, you never have companies over a certain size because partnerships don't work above a certain size. And yet we have a government system, federal government system, that was designed for a much smaller country, but never evolved, which is why, by the way, the president has so much power now because the Congress and Senate are so
dysfunctional.
So dysfunctional, right?
Peter, you're a student of history and you're 100% correct. Like, our system needs to be upgraded and modernized, but instead it's stuck in the past. And then we wonder why it's not working. I'm going to suggest this really should be the mission of Chinese Americans and Asian Americans, just to raise our hands and say, hey guys, should probably upgrade and modernize the system. Yeah. Because in the absence of upgrading and modernizing the system, we're just going to get polarization and clash, and eventual strife and civil war. And you know who will be stuck in that? Us.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? We'll be on the outside looking in, being like, hey, why are things like so bizarre? They don't make sense. Like we're smart enough to see the design flaws. Yeah. And I'm just going to throw out some numbers just so you can see how deep the design flaws are. Put into the chat, even though I can't see them. What do you think the approval rate is for US Congress right now? Peter, you might know the number, but just
it's a very low. It's a very low number.
It's between 20 and 28%.
Yeah.
What is the re-election rate for individual members of Congress? 94%. So for all of you who run businesses out there, imagine if 3 out of 4 of your customers were unhappy, but you changed nothing. That is the American political system in a nutshell, because 90% of the districts are drawn to be uncompetitive in the general, which, by the way, then empowers the minority, the 10% who control the party primaries in each party, to determine all of our politics. And then we're somewhere in the middle being like, what the hell is happening to the country? We're living through this archaic design flaw, like decrepit, dysfunctional system. And the dark thing about this country right now is, like, if you raise your hand and say, hey guys, like your design is screwed up, like you need to upgrade the design, what happens? Each side will attack you and say, oh, you know what? Like you're a secret, like Trumper, you're a secret, like you know, it's like, because in this country right now, 95% of things will get turned into a political football. Like the speaker's husband gets attacked in his home, political football, like, 36 hours later. So it's going to be up to us to fix this design. If we do not, we will witness unthinkable scenes in this country.
Question number 2, Daniel A. What are some of the ways that you think an average young Asian American could get involved and get engaged politically?
Well, it's a great question. I would recommend you find a candidate or campaign that you're excited about and just lean into it. It could be in your neighborhood or community. It could be someplace else, but just go really hard for someone or something. And if you're energetic and competent, you'll get noticed, because politics does not draw that many energetic, competent people. And so, but that's what I would say for young Asian American. Just find a candidate or campaign you're animated about and lean into it.
Yeah. One other question here was from Vincent Ma, who says, why do you think Asians have difficulty uniting? The divide seems to be deeply rooted in our history. What can we do to change this?
I think it's important for us to lead by example, which is to reach out to other Chinese Americans and Asian Americans and say, hey, look, I'm doing this event for Alan Fung or whomever it is, and just keep drawing people in and keep beating that drum. Why are we not more unified? I think it's because we still feel our place in this country is tenuous. Mm-hmm. And so most of us are still not confident enough to think outside of our own individual or family's material success. And then if you get that confidence that you're like, look, we're going to be here a while, my kids are going to be here a while, that you start seeing things that are outside of your domain as being important to you. And a lot of Asians aren't there yet.
Yeah. Okay. So Mr. Yunat and Anonymous asked the last question here. Andrew, will you try running for the White House again? Question mark.
So right now, and I hope you all sense this about me, like I just want to try and make it so this country will head on the right track. And I think the most important thing we can do right now is amend and upgrade some of the institutions and the incentives. I think we're past a point where having a good person in office, I prefer good people in office to not good people. But one of the traps we're in right now is people think, if I just got a good person in, then problems would be solved. But the problems just keep rolling on because it's the systems that need to get changed. So let's change the systems. Like that's what I'm working on. And we're making rapid progress. Would love everyone's help. Does that include a future political run? For me, I just want to do something that's going to be positively impactful. If I think it's not going to be helpful, I'm not going to do it. I don't have some burning desire to, sit in a particular seat. But I do think that there's a massive opportunity or set of opportunities coming up, where the confidence in the two-party system is at a record low. 62% of Americans want a third party. 58% of Americans aren't interested in either Biden or Trump being president in 24. Their combined age that year will be 159. And they'll be walking emblems of a failing political system. And so if you were to have some alternative that, by the way, also could design its own nomination process so that people in California and New York and Pennsylvania and Connecticut could participate in real time, as opposed to being told to wait until the Iowans and New Hampshire voters and others go, which is another example of an archaic system that doesn't make any sense. And also, I'm going to suggest is bad for Asians because we tend not to live in those states.
Yeah.
That if you had a more modern process, you could get millions, tens of millions of Americans energized about an actual functioning democracy and do it in a way that would leapfrog the legacy parties and leave them arguing for just ridiculousness. They'd be like, no, 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 you have to wait for the Iowans, and be like, wait, I don't care about the Iowans doing any other point in time. Like, why do I care now? By the way, I campaigned in Iowa for months. You know what percentage of Iowans participated in the Democratic primary? 6.5%. All of that attention being paid to 6.5% of a relatively
small number.
rural state.
Right.
You know, the current political structures make zero sense.
Yeah.
And if you were to design something that made more sense in real time for the American people to participate in, you could actually like push things forward very, very quickly.
Yeah. You know, I happen to be at a meeting with someone, you know, in Congress, and I made the statement about, you know, we've got a system that was designed in 1776 and hasn't been redesigned, and it really ought to be designed. And he paused for about 5 minutes and didn't know what to say. And he says, I totally agree with you. I just don't know how to fix the problem. Right. And
that summarizes where most people who are within the system are.
Yeah.
Is like, if you get them, you know, to be honest with you, it's like, hey, you think that things are working great? Like, they're all like, oh no, it's terrible. Like they're having these private conversations, but then they're stuck. You know, they're stuck. It's going to take a popular movement rising up and saying, okay, we get it. You're stuck. We're going to fix it for you. We're going to unstick you. We're going to fix your incentives. We're going to make this stuff make sense for our own sakes, for our kids' sakes. Like, we don't care about you. But then if you talk to officials, then, you know, it's like, you got to get a couple drinks in them and, you know, get them in private, but they'll agree with you because they know.
Yeah. Well, you know, we're running out of time, and we try to start on time and end on time. I will make one personal comment, which is, it's important in life to do things that you care about. And in particular, if you care about things outside of yourself, it's very important. And, you know, I started this Committee 100 Asian American Career Ceilings for reasons totally because I cared about the problem and trying to help people understand the issues and see what could be done about it, because there's no personal benefit to me. And that's what I think people need to find. And Andrew, that was clearly your motivation, which is how you can make a difference. And I hope a lot of you in the audience find your own way, right, to make a difference. By the way, I'm going to end with one thing, which one of the questions which I won't have you answer is someone said, you know, you really ought to think about starting a third party. That was one of the questions.
One step ahead of you, forwardparty.com, the third biggest political party in the country by resources, andrewyang.com. I did write this book, which got me to this point. But, you know, let's try and leave this country in fighting shape for our kids, or else we're going to be making some, you know, tough decisions. I mean, it's a tough time. Yeah. Like, don't have any illusions. This country is not flourishing. Yeah. It needs people like us.
Yeah. Well, I want to just end by thanking you, Andrew, for agreeing to be a speaker in this fireside chat. I think you really shared some thoughts that I think were very, very useful for people who are thinking about this problem and whether they want to run for office or try to get an appointed position and so forth. So I want to thank you very much, and I want to thank the audience for some really wonderful questions. And please do sign up for the December 12th event. I think you're going to find it very interesting. So thank you very much, Andrew, and all of that. I want to wish everyone a good evening, and a good midterm election for whatever position you're trying to promote.
Oh yeah. Get out there and then make your voice heard next Tuesday. Thank you, Peter. Thank you, everybody.
Yep, bye.